Okay, so we're thinking about the portion of Shelach, the portion of the mission of Moshe to send the spies to Israel. And it's a very beautiful parsha. Like I said on Tuesday, it's also sad, but it took me a long time to realize that it's sad because it's so beautiful in the sense that all the messages and the lessons are so beautiful. There's also the very Hasidic take on this parsha that now became very popular, but essentially it's a Hasidic take explaining the mistake of the spies. And pretty much one way or the other, we touch upon this every year. So that aspect is not going to be totally new, but well, the plan for today is I printed a discourse from the Rebbe and with the help of AI, translated into English, took me about 10 seconds. So we can get a little bit more detailed into the analysis and find interesting connections. So I'm very excited about it. What is the Hasidic perspective on the parsha, on the spies? So the conventional interpretation is somehow they lose faith in God. And they do lose faith in God. And they say God cannot help us. And then there's all kinds of other psychological perspectives where the idea is that they don't believe in themselves. They believe that God can do it, but they're not sure they can do it. So there's all kinds of interpretations. The Hasidic idea, and like I said, now it became mainstream, but it's essentially a Hasidic idea, is that the reason why they didn't want to go to Israel is not because they were afraid that God would not be able to help them conquer the land. That would be absurd because they had firsthand experience of the miracles, the Exodus and the splitting of the sea and the going through the desert and eating the manna. And even I like to say that when the spies came back and convinced the people that God can help them, what did the Jews eat for supper that night? They ate manna. So they were living on miracles. So while they're living on miracles, um, to say that that was all about not believing in God's ability, it's a little bit hard to accept. Now, of course, there's some of that, but the question is, what's at the core? And the Hasidic interpretation is that at the core is they didn't want to go to Israel. Why did they want to go to Israel? Not because they were afraid. I mean, they were afraid, not because they were afraid of the battle, the conquest, maybe that too, but not primary. Primarily, the reason why they didn't want to go to Israel is because they didn't want to shift and transition from a spiritual life to a life of materialism and agriculture, which takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of is distracting to spiritual study and spiritual pursuit. And in a way, when you come to agriculture, it's also there's a danger that you can become materialistic and just want physical wealth. And if you think about the history of Egypt, which they were running away from, once you get to agriculture, that's where exploitation starts, right? Because slavery starts with its agriculture because then you need manpower to work the fields. So agriculture is a spiritual threat, and the people that are afraid of the spiritual challenge. They'd rather stay in the desert where they can feel connected to God. And there's a beautiful verse that they say. They say we came to this land. Amongst other things, they say Eretz ochelet yoshveha. It's a land that consumes, that eats up, that consumes its inhabitants. And Rashi has an interpretation. And Rashi says what that means is that while they were traveling, they saw funerals or wherever they went. There were always people dying, and there were funerals. And God does this as a miracle to protect the spies. So everyone should be distracted and not think about the people running around trying to scout for their protection. That's the conventional interpretation. Hasidic interpretation is it's a land that swallows up those who live there. In other words, if you're going to go in there and you're going to try to invest in agriculture and work the land is going to swallow you up. Materialism is going to swallow you up, and you're not going to be able to maintain the same level of devotion that you had in the desert. Now, in the desert, they were not perfect. They were complaining, etc., but they did study Torah, and they did study Torah without distraction. In fact, the Talmud says that the Torah was given to the people who ate the manna. In other words, to be able to excel in Torah, you need to have a certain period of time that you're dedicated completely and immersed completely, and you're not distracted by the need to earn a living. So that's where they were, and this transition is what they were afraid of. Now, once you don't want to do something, you don't believe you can do it. You don't believe God can do it. You don't want it. I mean, we can start talking about the psychological effects of that, but it all boils down to, do you want it? But that's another story. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. I mean, they were not all be on the same page of what to tell, right? So I was just wondering what was Moses, and they were all spiritual people, very spiritual, of
You
course.
mean the spies or you mean the Jews? The
The spies,
spies, yeah.
the bearers of the news.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
they were all very spiritual people, right? So, but the Caleb and Joshua, what was their attitude? They were also very spiritual, and Moses was very spiritual.
Right,
Kind of
right.
he kind of sensed that he even renamed Joshua because he probably knew that there's going to be some um,
Struggle brewing. Yeah.
misunderstanding.
Yes.
Put it this way. So,
So,
what was their attitude towards this
so,
reality?
so, so one, there's different, essentially it's the will of God, right? What makes something valuable? What makes something right? Or the point is the will of God. The point is not to be spiritual, right? The point is the will of God. God wants us to go, so that's what we have to do, right? I'd rather be at Sinai. You have the story when Moshe repeats the story of the journey through the desert 40 years later in Deuteronomy, he says that after being at Sinai for a year, God says to Moshe, Rav lachem shevet bahar hazeh. It's enough for you sitting at this mountain. It's like enough already. It's like enough already. Now the question is, what's enough already? We did amazing things. Got the Torah. We built a tabernacle. The divine presence dwelled amongst the Jews. It's an amazing thing, right? But at some point you say it's enough already because that's not the goal. That's not the goal. The goal is not to remain at Sinai. The goal is to implementation. And implementation has its own challenges and its own sacrifices and its own trade-offs. But ultimately, the question is, what is God's what is God what is God what is God desire? Now, by the way, you can zoom out for a second before we even get to the Rebbe's discourse. You can zoom out for a second, and you can ask yourself a different question. And this is an essential question. And this is it will affect everything you think about, which is what is the purpose of creation? What is the purpose of creation of the physical world? And here, essentially, you have two models. And there's essentially two models. One model would be, and that's the conventional model, that the purpose of creation of the world is not for the world itself. Because the world is a place of pain, the world is a place of imperfection. The world is more like how do I say this? The world is more like a opportunity to be tested. And if you can pass the test and you can live a moral life, then you're worthy of spiritual reward in heaven. Either heaven or Messianic age, it depends who you ask. Maimonides would say heaven. And you say, why does God create challenge? Because the answer is when the soul was in heaven, there's no challenge. And with the angels, there's no challenge. If there's no challenge, there's no meaning. So we create an environment that has challenge. And then when we remain committed to God and remain committed to morality, then the good that we will receive in heaven, in other words, the feeling of connection to God and the understanding of God, which is the spiritual reward, now we earned it because now it's our own creation. Now, there's all kinds of variations of this model, but essentially what they're all saying is the same thing. The goal is the spiritual. The way to get to the spiritual, you have to go to the physical. Okay, so you have to make the world a better place. You have to do kindness in the physical world. You have to do mitzvot. All good. But essentially what's happening is the ultimate goal is this is sort of a stepping stone so that we get to the goal, which is the spiritual reality. And that's one model. And like I said, most religions and most genres probably within Judaism also have some form or another of this model. But Judaism, all forms of Judaism is a little bit more complex. But the other side is the Hasidic model and the Kabbalistic model. And it starts a little before, it starts Nachmanides and others. And they say, no, it's a misunderstanding. The ultimate goal is the physical world. The ultimate goal is to fulfill the will of God. The will of the God is manifest in the physical world. Now, why that is, how that is, what's the philosophy behind it, we can talk about that for a long time. But let's just understand, in other words, the big picture is that the goal is the physical with all the physical challenges. But that's the goal. It's not a means to an end. It's not like you have to live in this physical world and overcome the challenges so that you get a portion in the world to come. No. everybody, everything, all of the purpose of creation, all of creation, the physical world and the spiritual worlds are oriented toward the will of God, and the arena of the will of God and the place where God derives pleasure, which is why we're here to begin with, is in this physical plane. But that's a general question. Now you can apply that to Israel as well. Israel versus desert. Desert is heaven, Israel is earth. You could look at Israel as, okay, you have to be in Israel because you have to live and you have to create a society, fine. But that's like, but the goal is to ultimately remain in the spiritual realm and create for yourself a haven, which is Shabbat, or when you study Torah, or when you pray, and that's the goal. Or you could say the goal is the will of God. The will of God is the mitzvah on the physical plane. Now, of course, it's not one or the other. There's both. In other words, it's like saying what's greater, Shabbat or the weekday? Of course, Shabbat is greater, but the purpose is the weekday, perhaps. So it's a little bit more complex. But I'm just saying, you say, what do the other people realize? The other people realize, what does Kalev say? Im chafetz banu Hashem. If God desires us. So the conventional interpretation of that verse is that other spies said, we are not able to conquer the land. And Kalev says, if Hashem desires us, then we can. But the Hasidic interpretation is, Im chafetz banu Hashem means we have God's will. We have God's will. Maybe I want to be at Sinai. Maybe I want to be in the desert. But what does God want from me? The desire of God is in us entering the land. And that's why we want to do it. And that's why we could do it. And that's why not only we do it because we have to, but we're enthusiastic about it because we understand that that's the goal and that's the purpose.
But does it mean that Moses understood that some of the spies, or majority of the spies, don't fully understand our mission?
We understand that it's a challenge. There's no question that the more spiritual somebody is going to be, the more this transition is more difficult. Now, difficult doesn't mean it's not necessary. It's critical, but it's a challenge. It's certainly a challenge. And you say Moshe selected the most spiritual people. Kulam Anashim, they were prominent men. They were righteous people. They were the leaders. So you say, how could it be the leaders lose faith first? And the answer is because, in fact, the leaders are more prone to this mistake because they are more in tune to spirituality. So they're more threatened by this transition from spiritual life to physical life. Now, of course, the goal is not just physical life, and that's a beautiful talk from the Rebbe next week about Korach. The mistake of Korach is the other extreme. The mistake of Korach is you just need action. You don't need spirituality. We can talk about that next week. But of course, the answer is the balance. But yes, the answer is that the spies, the leaders, the most spiritual people are the most prone to make this mistake. Are the people who are sensitive to spirituality are going to be the ones who it's going to be hardest for them to move from the spiritual reality. If that makes sense.
And knowing that, he stands them.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, knowing that, he still stands them and even spells out the mission that you
Yeah.
have.
Yeah, because going into the physical world means accepting a certain degree of risk. There's no other way to do it, right? That's the whole point. The whole point is you're going to a space of where there's challenge and there's risk, and where there's high risk, there's high reward, right? In other words, we're moving to an area where it's another problem. There's so many details here, but another perspective is the people. They believed in God's ability to do miracles, but they didn't believe in God. But they thought once we enter Israel, there are no more miracles, or at least no more open miracles. So they say, of course, if God wants to split the sea, He can. But that's not what He's telling us to do. When we conquer the land, we're going to have to actually wage war, and that we can't do that. So in other words, because the natural odds are against us. So in other words, essentially, they don't understand that God could exist in the space within nature, so to speak. So how did I get to that? Because the whole idea of going into Israel is going into a place where God's presence is not obvious and the risk is high. And then I mean that's the goal. That's the whole point. The whole point is, like the Medrash says, and Hasidism makes it the purpose, highlights it. Purpose of creation is to create a home for God in the lowest plane. The lowest plane is the physical world, specifically where the risk is high. Okay, Bob, you want to say something, Bob? It's a free country. We don't make anybody.
I'm on the phone. I'll be right back.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So um, the big idea is like this. The Hebrew word, let's look think about the Hebrew word, because a lot of times the deep ideas in the Hebrew language are, um, I just want to say one more thing before I get to the big idea. So we may have talked about this, we haven't talked about this on Tuesday, but I think in the past years we have. When in the book of Deuteronomy, which is the Moshe's account of, maybe it isn't, maybe it's actually over here, who knows? Let me take a quick look. Take a quick look. No, it's not here. It's in Deuteronomy. But the point is like this. In Deuteronomy, oh, go ahead, Bob. Go ahead.
Sorry, the hospital was calling. I just wanted to say that I don't know if you listen to Rabbi Sachs every week.
I read him most weeks, not
Uh,
this
but
weekend.
but what he said this week so was in tandem with what you were saying, because he talked about a psychologist who basically talks about a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And he said it's the fixed mindset, you'll stay in your comfort zone and not really because it makes you feel inadequate. And they said the worst thing a parent can do is tell Jimmy that they're perfect and everything they do is perfect. So Jimmy will never really extend beyond their borders for fear of letting anybody down. He said, on the other hand, Caleb, who is from the tribe of Judah, and Yehoshua, whose name was changed, and they made a point of anybody who undergoes a name change, like Avram to Abraham and Jacob to Israel, they're by definition growth people. And
Right.
that this very much described the two exceptions to the spies, and
Yeah,
the
beautiful.
other
Beautiful.
ones were in fixed mindsets.
Right. Yeah.
So I
That's
just thought
beautiful
I'd
because that's
say you
broadening it
and
out.
Rabbi
That's saying,
Sachs agree.
yeah, no, that's beautiful because that's saying it in general. That's saying it applies to every situation. It's not just a challenge of
Correct.
physical, spiritual, but any situation. So the Hasidic movement is the Hasidic interpretation I want to talk about today is very much aligned with that. Also the broader concept. And it's always goes back to the Hebrew language because the Hebrew language has within it many secrets of the Torah. So you talk about the word Shlach lecha anashim, send men for you. Oh, I was going to say something. Okay. We'll stay here. Can't jump. We can't do everything in 1 hour. Okay, so the opening statement of the parasha: Shlach lecha anashim v'yaturu. Send men for you, and they will scout. Latur literally means to scout, but it's like similar to the English word to tour. I have to look into that. What's the relationship between those two words? But it's exact. It's almost the same. It's phonetically it's the same thing. So it's to scout. And we talked about this on Tuesday, that when Moshe talks about this in Deuteronomy, and he says how the people came and they said, "Shlach lecha anashim v'yachperu," send men for us, and they shall also spy. But that word means something else. That word means literally to dig, but it also means cherpa, which is shame. In other words, the purpose of the spy is to see the vulnerability of the land. See, every country is going to try to show how strong they are and hide their vulnerabilities. And the job of the spy is to uncover the weak points. And in fact, when you look, I said this on Tuesday as well, but when you look at Joseph, when Joseph um, accuses his brothers of being the spies, he says, "You came to see the nakedness of the land." What does that mean? It means same idea. The job of the spy is to see the vulnerability of the space of the place. Now, we talked about this on Tuesday, but it's a beautiful interpretation, and that is that Moshe says, go scout the land, go see the beauty of the land. But they go to see the problem in the land. In other words, you're going to see what you're looking for. That's essentially that first message. But related to that message is the one I want to say today, and that is that the Hebrew word for v'yaturu is the same word for yitaron, advantage. So it's fascinating concept. So you have advantage. So Shlach Lecha Anashim, send for you men, v'yaturu et Eretz Canaan, and they will get an advantage from the land of Canaan. And this ties into the idea that Vicky says, so what did Kalev understand? When they understood that going into the land is challenging. And the idea is, what Bob says, is that a challenge is growth. There can be no growth without challenge. And the Medrash talks about this, that the word v'yatur is yitaron, the advantage. And here, the Rebbe talks about this and says like this. He says that there's a beautiful verse in King Solomon's book of Proverbs. So in Proverbs it says, King Solomon says, Ra'iti ani, I saw that there's yitaron, there's an advantage, all the same word. Remember, we're quoting all the words that have the word advantage, because v'yaturu means to scout, but it also means to find the advantage. To find the advantage means to look for the good in the land, but it's much more than that. Understand how the challenge itself is going to create the advantage and create the growth. Okay, so the next point is, so King Solomon says, I have seen that there's an advantage to chachma, to wisdom over folly, over foolishness, just like there's an advantage of light to darkness. So that's a nice verse. Wisdom is enlightenment, wisdom is light, and darkness is foolishness. So there's an advantage for light over darkness. There's an advantage for wisdom over foolishness. That's the conventional interpretation. The Hasidic interpretation is not light is better than dark. That's obvious. Nobody has to say that. You don't need King Solomon, the wisest of men, to tell you that light is better than dark. Instead, what the verse is saying, Yitron Ha'or, the advantage from light, Mina Choshech, not I've seen the advantage of light over darkness, not over. Literally, it's from. I've seen the advantage of light from the darkness. What does that mean? That the light that comes from the darkness is greater than the light that had no darkness to begin with. In other words, that working through the darkness leads you to greater light than had you not had to struggle with darkness to begin with. And the metaphor and the example that the Rebbe brings is the example of comparing and contrast. Well, the simple example that if you understand something right away, okay, so you have a certain level of understanding. But if there's a difficulty, and you have to struggle to understand it. And then when you finally understand it, because it was difficult for you, you end up with a far deeper understanding. Meanwhile, the guy next to you who understood it right away, so it was easier for them, but they don't have to go, they don't have to dig, they don't have as deep as understanding as someone who had to struggle to understand it. And this goes to we may have mentioned it in the past, but there's a difference between the Babylonian Talmud and Jerusalem Talmud. And the Babylonian Talmud is referred to by the Babylonian Talmud itself. And if you're the Babylonian Talmud and you had to praise yourself, what would you say? You say, I'm the better Talmud. No. They say that there's a verse in Eicha, in Lamentations. There's a verse in Lamentation that says, Machshakim Hashivani, God placed me in darkness. By the exile, God placed me in darkness. Now, where were we exiled in the first temple, after the destruction of the first temple? We were exiled to Babylonia. So the Talmud says that when the verse says, when Jeremiah laments and says, God placed me in darkness, says the Talmud, Zet Talmuda Shel Bavel, that's the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is a place of darkness. Everything is a struggle to understand. Every question it takes pages and pages to get to resolve, and we have to bring up all these possibilities and all knocked down. It's a long process because it's like somebody in a room and the lights are off. You have to find the door. What do? You just tap everything. You tap this wall, this table, that. Finally, you get to the opening. And by contrast, the Jerusalem Talmud is relative to the Babylonian Talmud very straightforward. It's very straightforward. Not that many questions, not that many difficulties, and it's much more straightforward. So that the Jerusalem Talmud is light, the Babylonian Talmud is darkness. Yet, what do we find? That the halacha, the ruling, follows the Babylonian Talmud. Why does the ruling follow the Babylonian Talmud? Specifically because the Babylonian Talmud has to work through the darkness, has to try every possibility. It doesn't get to the answer immediately. So it has to struggle to find the answer. And the understanding is that if you have to struggle to find the answer, then there's a greater advantage. And that ties into the concept where there is advantage from the darkness, for the light that comes from the darkness, from the experiencing darkness and transformation of darkness. So that's one idea of that the Hebrew word for viaturu is not just scout the land, but it's scout the land and scout and understand the yitaron, the advantage. So when the spiritual person has to come down into the physical world, so on the surface, he's moving into a place of darkness, but he's actually reaching a greater advantage because you're challenged, if the spiritual life is challenged, and then a person is committed to the spiritual life and cultivating and celebrating a spiritual life, even though it's a challenging environment, then that connection that is created is far deeper. So that's one point. And then there's another beautiful story that the Rebbe offers in this discourse, which we usually don't do stories, but today it's a beautiful, beautiful story, and it's a Talmudic story. So I want to read the Talmudic story inside. If you haven't heard it, it's an amazing story. If you heard it, it's also an amazing story. But in the meantime, Vicky, go ahead, please.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. I just want to make sure that I understood the idea. So, are you saying that if you are on a higher spiritual level, then it's easier for you to understand the importance of being in the real world and the importance of the mission? That's what Caleb and Joshua did, or you saying that they all were on a high spiritual level, but it's just more. They had more insight into it. So
I
just
would say, so Bob quoted Rabbi Sachs, it says growth mentality. I would say, if you want the Hasidic term for that, I would say it's actually not a question of insight. I would say it's more like humility, right? In other words, the ability to go out of your comfort zone. Where does that come from, right? So it comes from submitting to the will of God, right? As opposed to I'm comfortable here, right? So I want to do this, and then you say, yeah, I want to be here. You want to be at Sinai, but God wants you in Israel. So where are you going to go? So even a spiritual person, the relationship with God, any relationship, there's a certain element of the self. Relationship, is it about me or is it about the other person? And every relationship is a little bit of both. But what is the primary thing? Why am I in this relationship? Because what it does for me, or because of I'm devoted to the other person. And again, you have to have both. But I'm saying if I'm in it if I'm in it and I say what am I comfortable with, then it's going to be harder for me to change or adapt or face the challenge. Remember, nobody seeks challenge. Most people don't. Some people do, but most people don't. Nobody wants challenge. Most people don't want to be challenged. Um, but a person who is Caleb and Joshua, which are from the Hasidic perspective, that comes from devotion as in humility. And there's a beautiful interpretation from the Rebbe that talks about what's based on the Medrash. The Medrash says like this. So why was Joshua able to remain loyal to the will of God? Well, he had a name change. God changed his name. So Moshe changed his name. Moshe prayed for him. If Moshe prays for you, you probably have a spiritual head start. So it's not surprising that he did not succumb to the mistake of the spies. But what about Kalev? Kalev is a self-made man. How did he go and manage to withstand the temptation or make the mistake of the spies and also stand up to the group? It's not a very easy thing to stand up to the group. We know that today. They do all the social experiments. Very difficult to stand up to the group. So the Medrash says like this. The Medrash says that when they came to Hebron, Kalev went and prayed at the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs. That's what the Medrash says. How do you know? The Medrash knows this because the verse says Vayalu vayavayu. It says in plural. They went up. They came to Hebron, and then it says Vayavo at Hebron, and he came to Hebron. So all of a sudden, there's a shift from plural to singular. What does that tell you? They all passed through the general region, but only one went to Hebron. Why would one go to Hebron? So the Medrash says this is Kalev, and he went and he prayed for divine assistance to save him from the council or the conspiracy of the spies, and that's how he was saved. So it's a beautiful Medrash, and it's like I said, it's rooted in the verses because the verse specifically says something. It says the in the individual Vayavo, and he came. Okay. So the Rebbe says all kinds of things about this Medrash. Very interesting Medrash. In other words, so now Kalev is self-made. In other words, he is able to remain loyal to God by virtue of his own prayer. He prayed at the patriarchs, whereas Joshua is from Moshe. So now it's top down and bottom up. So which is a better model? Who's going to be more effective? Is it the person that Moshe prayed for or the person who prayed for himself? So the Rebbe says always bottom up. Always when a person does it by himself, it's more internalized. Kalev was more effective. How do we see? Because when it comes to the people who argued with the spies, yes, there were two spies, both Kalev and Joshua, who did not agree with the spies, but who led the debate? Who spoke up to the people? Not Joshua. Joshua was totally silent. Only Caleb was the one who answered the people and insisted and debated and insisted that we could do it. So you see that there's an advantage in Caleb who worked through it by himself. So that's beautiful. But that's not why I said this. I tried to say that I said something else. The Rebbe talked about this in 1950, right after the previous Rebbe passed away. And he said that if you look at the Hebrew words of the Medrash, halach v'nishtateach al kivrei avot. He went to pray at the tomb of the patriarchs, at the graves of the patriarchs. But the way they would pray then, literally hishtateach means to lie down flat. And that's how they would pray. So they would bow down in the temple. We don't do it anymore outside the temple, but that's what the word says. You bow, but it's not just bow, it's literally lie flat. And what is this? What is this form of prayer? And you could see, what is this form of prayer? What does this mean you're lying flat? It's like a weird thing. We don't think of it. We're Western people. We don't lie down flat. So what the Hasidic interpretation is that, by the way, that's the idea of also bowing. Why do we have to bow to God? Now we don't bow all the way, but in the temple we would bow down flat, and we say, you know what? You can't bow outside the temple. What's bowing? So bowing is a certain level of humility where you feel that your head and your feet are equal, that your mind, which is the superior part of the body, a superior part of humanity, that's what makes me human in my mind, that's what makes me unique. It's before God, it's just as my feet. It's not more special. It's not closer to God than my feet. So it's an absolute surrender of my own perspective. And that's why in the temple you could do it, because the presence of God was felt. So in the presence of God, you could feel that level of humility. Now, outside the temple, you can't bow down because we're not talking about just the physical posture. It's not yoga, right? We're talking about the awareness of the humility before God. That's not accessible outside the temple. So, but the point is, going back, Kalev goes and lies flat on the tomb, on the graves of the patriarchs. That ever says it's the humility. If you're willing to be humble and you're willing to say that my perspective is not the ultimate goal, then you're going to make the right choice because you're humble yourself to the will of God. I'm getting carried away, but there's a beautiful interpretation that says, a Hasidic interpretation, when you say Musaf on the holidays, when we say the Musaf, we talk about the destruction of a temple, because Musaf is about mentioning the offerings, and we lament in the Amidah, even though holiday is supposed to be happy. But it's interesting that we do in the Musaf, we lament the fact that the temple was destroyed, and we could no longer bring the offerings. And it says, and then we say when Mashiach comes, when the temple will be rebuilt, we'll once again fulfill the commandment of bringing the offerings. But one of the things we say, because of our sins, we were exiled from our land, and we can no longer come and bow before God. So literally, it means you can't bow before God in the temple. But the Hasidic interpretation is we can no longer bow. Why can't you bow? Bow down. No, you can't bow. You cannot sense the awareness of God to the extent that you will feel that your head and feet are alike before God. That level of the experiencing God is not accessible anymore unless the temple stood and the presence of God was manifest. And when you came there, you sensed the presence of God, which the effect on the person is the idea of how the person is insignificant compared to the presence of God. Okay. That is the interpretation of the challenge, a challenge being an advantage. Now there's a very beautiful story. It's also a very sad story. I think I'm going to put it in my email today, but if I do, I'm not going to put in the last 3 lines because it's too sad. But the story is a very telling story about Jewish culture and how we have a culture of debates and how the idea when you challenge me, I'm not offended. In fact, I feel like it's a blessing. And there's an amazing story about this, absolutely amazing story. So if you haven't heard the story, it's a great story. If you did hear the story, it's also a great story. So I'm going to read the story. I'm going to read it in English and the Hebrew. I'm going to share the screen. Okay. Share the screen. So this is a story about Rabbi Yochanan, one of the greatest sages, Talmudic sages, Rabbi Yochanan. And he had a study partner who was actually his brother-in-law, Reish Lakish, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, which is a fascinating person. He started up being a thief, and then he had this interaction with Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan influenced him to come back to study, and then he became a great scholar. They became study partners. Okay. The bottom line is, Reish Lakish dies. I'm jumping in the middle of the story, but this is the part that's relevant to us. Ultimately, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Reish Lakish, died. Rabbi Yochanan was sorely pained over losing him. He was like in mourning. It was a study partner. It wasn't his parent. It wasn't his child. It was a study partner. The rabbi said, who will go to calm Rabbi Yochanan's mind and comfort him over the loss? They said, let Rabbi Eliezer ben Pedat go, as his statements are sharp, meaning he's a great student. If Rabbi Yochanan wants another study partner, this rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer ben Pedat, is a great study partner. He's the sharpest guy we know. I.e., he is clever and will be able to serve as a substitute for Reish Lakish. So this is the story, how it unfolds. What a story, what a story. Rabbi Eliezer ben Pedat went and sat before Rabbi Yochanan. With regard to every matter that Rabbi Yochanan would say, Rabbi Eliezer ben Pedat would say to him, there is a ruling which is taught in the Baraita that supports your opinion. So everything Rabbi Yochanan would say, Rabbi Yochanan would start teaching. Whatever he would say, this rabbi would say, he was an unbelievable scholar. He had all this information in his head, because remember, the Talmud wasn't written then. And he would say, oh, you said is right. Because generations earlier, there was a rabbi, the Braita, the sages of the Mishnah agreed with you. And basically, whatever Rabbi Yochanan said, this guy would write a thesis to support it. Rabbi Yochanan said to him, are you comparable to the son of Lakish, to Reish Lakish? In my discussions with the son of Reish Lakish, when I would state a matter, he would waste 24 difficulties against me in an attempt to disprove my claim. Every word I said, 24 questions. And meaning oppose me from 24 sources. And I would answer him 24 answers. And the halacha by itself would become broadened and clarified. And yet you say to me there is a ruling which is taught in the Baraita that supports your opinion? Do I not know that what I say is good? Being rebuted by Reish Lakish served their purpose. You're bringing proof to my statements does not. And terrible story. Rabbi Yochanan went around rending his clothes, weeping and saying, where are you, son of Lakish? Where are you, son of Lakish? Rabbi Yochanan screamed until his mind was taken from him. He went insane. The rabbis prayed and requested for God to have mercy on him and take his soul, and Rabbi Yochanan died. Okay? What a story. But the point here is, what the story is showing, that in Jewish culture, if I get up and say a speech, and you say, oh, wonderful speech, you're not helping me. That's not the Yitron, that's not the advantage. The challenge, if you could challenge me and try to disprove me, that's what you celebrate. That's a good study partner. A good study partner is a person who's going to challenge you, not someone who's just going to agree with you, because we understand, again, that the point of the challenge is the point of challenge. Challenge is synonymous with growth. And that's the idea that the spies miss. What do the spies say? It's so challenging. It's so difficult. There's so many challenges. That's exactly where the advantage comes from. Now, one more detail within the word v'yaturu, because so far we said two interpretations. We said the yaturu is to tor, to scout, to tor. I like the word tor because it sounds like yaturu, latur, same word. Then there's another word that we said is yitaron, advantage. But there's one more word which is a little bit more philosophical, and that is basically a toar. Toar is the form. And in Greek philosophy, and Maimonides was all over this also, there is the matter and the form. And the matter is the physical, and the form is spiritual, because it's more spiritual, right? You just have a piece of matter, that matter can't do anything. There's no spiritual purpose. It doesn't serve any purpose. It's just matter. It's just a lump. If you form it into something, then the form within that form, that form expresses the purpose. You have a piece of wood. What do you do with a piece of wood? You make it a table. That's the form. Oh, now I understand there's a spiritual purpose. There's a purpose in the table. So in other words, form, even on the physical plane, making a form of a piece of wood. But in general, in Greek philosophy, the word for form was synonymous with the word for spiritual, because the form is more abstract than the matter. So now let's go back to the word. Shlach lecha anashim, send men for you. V'yaturu et eretz Canaan. So far we have two interpretations. We'll add the third. They will tour the land of Canaan. They will get an advantage from entering the land of Canaan, but that's the third. The middle one, where does the advantage come? V'yaturu et eretz Canaan. They will impart form to the physical, to the materialism of Canaan. In other words, bringing spirituality to Canaan. So the point is not to move to Canaan and forget about spiritual life. No, the point is to impart spirituality in the physical existence. You are plowing, you're planting, you're investing in agriculture, but the purpose of that, it's not just the body, it's not just the matter. There is a form for why you're doing this all. And the form is the spiritual purpose. And when you scout, and then you impart the form, then you get to the advantage. So now all those three words are all bottled into one, and that gets you to the story of the spies in short. So a lot more to say, but I think we'll stop for today. If anyone has any comments or questions or suggestions or additions, we'd love to hear. Otherwise, everyone should have a wonderful, wonderful Shabbat.
Hazak Baruch.
Hazak Baruch. Thank you.
Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat
Shabbat
shalom.
shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Be well.